So I realize, yeah, I'm just going to take this down for a minute. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming, and also welcome everybody who's here virtually. I'm Tracy McFadden, and I'm director of Friends of the Morrill Homestead, and we are a nonprofit that supports this site and by bringing programs like this here. And we also help with the gardens and grounds and any other way that we can. This site itself, this is a Vermont State Historic Site, the Justin Morrill Homestead, and it's owned and operated by the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And if you have not yet had a tour inside Senator Morrill's home, I really recommend that. It's an amazing home, and all the furnishings and decor and artwork is original. And we are open on weekends from 10 to 5 until October 10th. So I recommend that. Quick note for people who are here, the restrooms are right across the way over there. For those people that are joining us on Zoom, can you please keep your computers on mute? And then when we have the discussion time at the end of this presentation, you can type your questions into the chat, and I will do my best to ask as many of them as I can. For those of you that are here in the audience, just know that if you are talking quietly to your neighbor, everybody out in Zoom land will probably hear you. So a quiet audience would be helpful. And I am happy to introduce Jess Robinson, who is Vermont State Archaeologist. And we're actually looking forward to Jess being back on the site next year when we need to dig up around the entire foundation of the home to put in more drainage. But before doing that, we are going to dig archaeologically first and see what we find. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Tracy, and thank you all for coming, both here and out in the world on Zoom. So my talk tonight is well, first of all, I'd also like to say it's the 26th year of Vermont Archaeology Month every September, and this is one of the first events. The first event was yesterday at Mount Independence, but happy Vermont Archaeology Month. COVID continues to sort of put a damper on some of the 40+ events we usually have, but we still have a number of ones. And so you can Google Vermont Archaeology Month if you want to see more that's happening across the state. Also, this is part of the first in a 3-part series that Tracy and the Morrill Homestead is hosting on the Abenaki, and will be followed up by 2 subsequent lectures about the history and sort of contemporary aspects of the Abenaki and just in general the indigenous presence in Vermont. And so I'm going to limit my talk almost exclusively to the Native American, the indigenous presence in Vermont and immediately adjacent areas prior to European contact. And then I don't exactly know what they're going to be talking about, but presumably they're going to be following up after European contact. So just a little point of background. At its most basic, archaeology is the study of the past, the human past, through the things that they left behind. These could be everything from small, tiny little artifacts, the remains of stone tool making in the ground, to giant architectural edifices like you would see in the Egyptian pyramids or in the great Mayan cities. It can even encompass landscapes that were cognized and thought about, and a bunch of other indicators that archaeologists use to sort of indirectly reveal what was going on in the past and how humans were living in the past. And of course, archaeology is a broad term. It encompasses the study of humans back from the start of what we call Homo sapiens and even before into pre-human hominids, across the world and through all times up until the present day. But here we're going to be talking about the indigenous presence in Vermont. The Native Americans across this continent have very particular and very often tragic histories. And so this is a video I show when I teach Native American histories class. Every one of these dots, it began in 1700, represents a post office, so a village, a town, a city. And in 1700, there were virtually none, except for some of the colonies going on. And then you can see this rapid spread. We're into the War of 1812 right now, rapidly filling in across everywhere east of Mississippi. Again, Florida is unrepresented because they were Spanish, and so actually there were plenty of people there too. And we're getting into the 1840s right now, and then you can see as 1849 comes, we see the gold rush, the rapid infilling of the West. And then by the time we get to the 1860s and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, then everything in between gets to fill in. These are what were the treaty lands. These were supposed to be Native American lands. They'd already been pushed and reservationized, exiled out to these various lands. And now all of this is filling in. And this graph really only goes to about 1900. Just to give credit where it's due, this was a UVM graduate who is now, at least it was the last time I checked, one of the New York Times infographic specialists. But just showing the infilling of the landscape, that was not empty, was previously filled with millions of Native American inhabitants. And the reverse here is just beginning at 1776, the taking away of lands or reservation lands. And then if you can see, if I run it one more time, the very last thing is the winking out of half the reservation lands. So just as a point of background, because archaeology, along with native oral history, some colonial histories and colonizing histories, can fill in this gap, but archaeology has a big part to play in telling a story, not the story, but filling in gaps, filling in the record of the people that lived here as far back as nearly 13,000 years now. So I crunched this data a few weeks ago for another purpose, but it's a great slide to show here. As of June 17th, there were 2,275 pre-contact or indigenous archaeological sites reported in Vermont. The number of dots in green is over there on the left, and then a heat map is on the right. No surprise that the densest archaeological deposits or the number of sites are in the Champlain Valley. And why is that? Were Native Americans living there more than in other places? No, it's because that's where the majority of the large-scale development that triggers archaeological review is. So that's where we look, and that's where we find sites. There may be slightly fewer archaeological sites, which may translate into slightly less archaeological presence over time in the eastern Vermont sort of Piedmont area, but we don't know nearly enough to say that definitively or even as a running hypothesis. There just has been so little work done in this area, including the area around Stratford, including the area up to the Northeast Kingdom. Once you get on the lands immediately adjacent to the Connecticut, we know a little bit more, but a lot of that is just through early collector and academic surveys rowing along the Connecticut River. Still relatively little until very recently, and in a few years, maybe we'll have a lot more to say, has been professionally excavated along the Connecticut. So I definitely tried to choose sites that that highlight specific periods and places in this side of Vermont, in the Connecticut River Valley and adjacent areas in the Piedmont, but I will be referring to other sites that likely have direct bearing on the other portions of Vermont because it tells a more fuller story where otherwise we have very little insight.
What's the Piedmont?
It's sort of, once you get off the Green Mountains on the eastern side, there's sort of higher elevation area until you drop down into the Connecticut River Valley.
Okay.
So we're going to go sequentially, and the Paleo-Indian period is the first period that archaeologists typically subdivide within the long span of the pre-contact past in Vermont. It's kind of an unfortunate name, but it just continues to go on year after year. People propose other terms and it doesn't really catch on. And the Paleo-Indian period is very interesting for a number of reasons. I study it in my own sort of personal scholarship quite a bit because it's a time that they were still in the indigenous people moving into Vermont. We'll talk more about this in a second. We're still sort of in the midst of the last throes of the last ice age. And I'll refer to this graph on the right in a second here, but what it shows is Greenland ice cores, the GISP2, in fact, ice core in the middle of Greenland that was conducted a number of years ago and was at that time the most precise record of sort of early climate, one of them in the world. And this is another graph I show when I teach quite a bit, because what this graph is actually showing is the amount of calcium in the ice core. And calcium is sort of a substitute or a proxy to look at environmental dynamism. It doesn't indicate how cold something is or how hot something is, how wet or so dry, but actually how much and how frequently those things change. It could be wet one year and dry another. And all of that storm events and everything kick up these light particles into the atmosphere. They carry on the winds to the Greenland ice sheet. They get embedded in the ice and then become like a layer cake. And so that's what scientists measure. And what we can see is 100,000 years ago, 80,000 years ago, things are pretty stable. Then beginning around 75,000 years ago, the climate goes absolutely haywire. And this is really the height of the last part of the last ice age. And things are crazy for, 50,000 years or so until we drop right down here around 13,300, 13,200 years ago. We get a smooth out, and then there's one last pulse. And that last pulse is what we call the Younger Dryas, or not we, I didn't make it up, but geologists call the Younger Dryas chronozone or epoch. And it's this last pulse of really cold, dry conditions. And that was the time when the Paleo-Indian, at least the first part of the Paleo-Indians, were living in Vermont. And then just, parenthetically, then the last 11, 12,000 years has been the most consistent in the last 100,000, give or take, maybe the 90,000 intervals, pretty close. And this, what archaeologists argue, has what one of the big drivers towards where we are today. Massive scale civilizations, global economies, city-states, all of these things, because the environment was predictable. You're not going to invest a lot of time building a village if next year there's going to be no water because there's a massive drought the last 15 years, or the flood that wipes everything away, or the landslide, or anything else. The environment needs to be predictable so you can invest in things and have a reasonable expectation that they will be there in 50 years, 100 years. And when that doesn't, things begin to happen. And obviously that has some analogs for today. So Paleo-Indian sites are interesting. The Paleo-Indian period is interesting because people made stone tools in very similar ways and in very characteristic ways across the unglaciated North America. It's really the only time in the pre-contact past where people in Washington state or in low parts of Canada and in Vermont and in Nova Scotia and in Florida made the same types of spear points, the same scraping tools, and very characteristic. And what were those? Well, the spear points are the most characteristic. They were elaborately crafted. You might think, if you weren't thinking critically, that because they were the oldest, perhaps they were the most simplistic or quote unquote primitive. But in fact, Paleo-Indians were the master craftsmen in stone, at least in this region, throughout the entire pre-contact past. And they would make these beautiful spear points with these elaborate flaking techniques. And then the very last thing they would do is they would make a small sort of wedge or nipple at the bottom of the point, and then they would take it off both sides and drive this channel up through, which is very characteristic. If you ever find one of these points, you know immediately it's a Paleo-Indian point, because no one else ever did this. And archaeologists still aren't sure why they did, because people made spear points for the next 8,000 years or so and never needed to do this and lived fine. And it resulted in breakage so much of the time that you did this. It's so difficult to execute that it's still a bit of an enigma why people did it. Was it social signaling? Was it, some sort of sacrifice, to the game you were about to hunt? Did it show your expertise? And because the stone tools that we are really all that lasts for many areas of the continent this far back in history, 13,000 to about 10,000 years ago, there began to be this very uncritical assumption that Paleo-Indians were big game hunters. They hunted the last of the mastodon that were living. There are sites in the Southwest which were some of the type sites, some of the earliest Paleo-Indian sites found that had, extinct camel, extinct bison, extinct horse. And so there began to be this just uncritical assumption that these were the big game hunters. They killed large animal. They needed really specific and expertly crafted spears and spear points to do this. In the northeastern region, this in the 70s and 80s thought, okay, well, up here they were hunting caribou. But Vermont is pretty interesting, because we, in the Paleo-Indian period, had quite different thing, or at least potentially large resource base here in the Champlain Basin, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But previously, as the glaciers were receding, the Champlain Valley and then the Hudson Valley, at one point, all had an enormous glacial lake filling it up, called Glacial Lake Vermont if you're living in Vermont, and if you're in New York, you call it Glacial Lake Albany, and if you're in Canada, they call it something different. But over in the Connecticut River Valley, there was an not equally, but large glacial lake called Glacial Lake Hitchcock. And so I am not exactly sure, and I don't know if geologists are exactly sure when this burst and flooded out. It might have been around 12,800. This one was around 13,300 the first time. And it catastrophically flooded when a dam burst down by Long Island. And this whole thing would have drained over 100 feet in a matter of days. So if you can imagine just the catastrophic floods that would have gone out into the ocean. And keep in mind, the continental shelf was actually exposed all the way out to Nantucket and Long Island. So there would have just been this massive pulse of fresh water coming out. Slightly forward in time, the final glacial Lake Vermont drained out of the St. Lawrence when the glaciers burst through that. And then, like a sponge, the land was so compressed by the weight of the glaciers that it was actually lower than sea level in the Champlain Valley. And seawater ran in. And beginning around 13,000 years ago, this was the start of the Champlain Sea, the tenure of the Champlain Sea in these areas, of which the southernmost arm corresponds to the low-lying areas of the Champlain Valley. And the Champlain Sea was not a barren water body. Paleontological remains of whale, of narwhal, many species of whale, finback whale, white whale, narwhal, as I said, walrus, various varieties of seals, a lot of varieties of fish, shellfish. So this was a very biotically productive water body. And as knowledge of the Champlain Sea and when it was established began to be known, which was relatively recently. We'd always known about the Champlain Sea, at least into the early 1900s, but when it came and went has really only been resolved in the last 10 to 15 years. Likewise, the chronology of the Paleo-Indian presence in the northeastern region and how specific spear points actually indicate time periods of the Paleo-Indian period has really only been resolved in the last 10 or 15 years. And there has never been a Paleo-Indian site found on the Vermont side of the Connecticut River, but important ones are located just on the New Hampshire side, including the Whipple site, just in the southernmost, across from southernmost Vermont. Another site which is not on here, Colebrook, very high up on the Connecticut River floodplain in highestmost New Hampshire, and then a whole complex of sites in the mountain foothills, the White Mountain foothills, called the Israel River Complex. So my colleagues John Kroc and Weatherby Dorshow and I decided to map all of the Paleo-Indian sites in the Vermont, in the Champlain Basin, with this new knowledge of timing when the Champlain Sea was here, and see what we could see. And the earliest Paleo-Indians that we have knowledge of in Vermont are this Bullbrook, West Athens Hill subperiod. It's a long name, which you don't really need to know about, but they made their spear points a specific kind of way. And you can see here a cluster of sites in what is now where the big box stores are in Williston, but back, or near them, but back at 12,700 years ago, it would have been an area where the Winooski River flowed right into the Champlain Sea, sort of paleo-estuary environment, if you will, very biotically productive. And so we think that it's no coincidence that this cluster of Paleo-Indian sites, including the largest Paleo-Indian site yet found in Vermont, the Mahan site, is located in that area. And we'll get back to some of these materials in a minute. Closer to home, meaning here, not too close, but a number of years ago, the University of Vermont Consulting Archaeology program was doing some archaeological review for an expansion of the Jackson Gore Atakimo ski area and resort, and found a very interesting Paleo-Indian site, not in the Champlain lowlands, not in the sort of foothills of the White Mountains, but actually in the Green Mountains at the base of a large foothill in a river valley. And one of the things our colleagues did was run some GIS analyses, what's called least cost path analysis, basically taking slope and terrain into account. What are the easiest ways to cross the state from known site in the Champlain Valley over the Connecticut? And this is Jackson Gore. And you can see it's right on the edge of this really interesting corridor, crossing from the lower Champlain Valley all the way over to the Connecticut River. And indeed, it appears to have been a place where they not only were probably crossing themselves, but perhaps were on a promontory overlooking areas where migrating herds of caribou or some other large animal was coming through, where they could easily intercept them. And we can kind of see that because the larger areas here are set back from the terrace edge, sort of the camping or living area, if you will. But there's one locus that's right up there that had some hunting tools in it that's really close to the terrace edge that then drops down into the valley bottom, where you could actually see over the edge. And so you can imagine laying in wait there, coming, intercepting game, and then coming back up. One of the more interesting things about this is, even though there are these characteristic fluted points, the fragment of one over there, they're in real rough shape and they're very worked down. And that's the way we saw every this entire assemblage, was that they're running out of stone to make tools. And they're really on their last legs trying to eke out every cutting edge they're utilizing. Every spear point that can remotely be turned into one is being turned into one. So we don't know whether they were going to the Connecticut or going to the Champlain Valley, but clearly a stone tool source would have to be quickly on the route. And one of the most interesting things is this Paleo-Indian stone bead, the only one that's really ever been found in the Northeast from this archaeological site. So to sum up the Paleo-Indian part of it, what my colleagues and I found out is that in Vermont and in adjacent areas of New York, areas that are on or immediately adjacent to the Champlain Sea were very attractive locales for Paleo-Indians, suggesting that they weren't simply big game hunters. They were utilizing the resources of the ocean, whether it was shellfish or fish, or perhaps marine mammals, seals, maybe even bigger things. Glacially formed kettle ponds and lakes, rare, large sources of fresh water, were also probably very important. At this point, the rivers were still cutting into their banks. They're probably really silt laden, probably not great places to drink from without a lot of settling out, things like that. But these kettle ponds are really still recently melted and probably very reliable sources of fresh water. And then travel corridors. And regarding that, one of the more interesting things about the Paleo-Indian period is that not only did they expertly craft stone tools, but they made them often from materials from locations far from the areas where the sites are found. So for instance, this site in Williston contained this reddish material from northern Maine, this yellowish waxy material from Pennsylvania. All of this material is from the Hudson Valley. And then they had local quartzite as well. Just a graph of that. And so one of the last things we did, my colleague and I, and said, well, we don't know a lot about the Paleo-Indian period, but we do know that these sources, we actually, Nathan Kitchell, who's now doing a postdoc at Dartmouth College, actually did XRF analysis on some of these tools, confirmed they were from these sources, not just lookalikes. But we know where the sources are. That's where Monsungan Lake is in northern Maine. We know where the site is. And so again, running a more complex least cost path analysis, what is the easiest way to get from Williston, Vermont to Monsungan Lake in Maine 12,500 years ago, 12,700 years ago. And when we were running this, and we ran things like slope and the direction of the water and potential forest cover at that time, and ran all these factors through a machine that my colleague Weatherby is very good at, and the machine crunched away and smoked for a few days, and then came out with what we were really surprised at, but which is quite obvious in retrospect, which is that yes, there's a couple inland routes, but by far the easiest route would have been just to go along the Champlain Sea and then cut into what's now the Etchemin River into the West Branch of the Penobscot and into this area, suggesting that the Champlain Sea was not only a place where there was really resource abundant, but that it was probably potentially an important travel corridor, either by using watercraft or we're pretty sure that at least the southern arm of the Champlain Sea froze in the winter because some of the seal species that we found only can rear their pups on solid ice. And so maybe they waited till the winter and just crossed over the ice, or could have walked along the beach margins. But in any case, Vermont is really at the forefront of in this part of the world, of really trying to balance out this view of Paleo-Indians as not just these, peripatetic big game hunters, but rather more complex hunter-gatherers that were utilizing all these very dynamic resources that were coming into play at this period. And Vermont, being the only landlocked New England state, has a great part to play in this because all of the continental shelf that would have been utilized by Paleo-Indians, and we might see those coastal sites, are now under hundreds of feet of water in most cases. But our sites have been, our landforms, our beach margins have been rising since the end of the Pleistocene. So we're really the only window we can see in it in this part of the world. So the next time period that we slice, as archaeologists slice into in this region, is the Archaic period, an equally unfortunate name that refuses to die. That's this broad sweep of time from roughly 9,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago. In between, there's a late Paleo-Indian period that's not well understood, but and just a shout out to our fellow sister state historic sites, Chimney Point, Crown Point area over here would have been under the waters of the Champlain Sea, but we have found early archaic, these sort of forked bottom, very characteristic spear points at Chimney Point, leading us to making us see that as soon as these lakeshore locales were exposed and available, people were moving out onto them. Moreover, we begin to see tools that we hypothesize were used in some form of fish processing along the rivers, particularly along the Missisquoi rivers, where we found these, but other early archaic sites in New England have people have recovered these tools from those sites too, usually in fish areas where fish would have likely been an important resource. During the Paleo-Indian period, again, the rivers were so dynamic, still cutting through the soil. There probably was not a lot of fish in them at all. It would have probably been a pretty harsh environment. But by this time, fish are filling in, the rivers are cutting into their banks, things are becoming more predictable, and Native Americans are utilizing these resources. I showed that graph that showed, the Holocene the last 10 or 12,000 years ago has been remarkably stable, but there were slight increases and decreases. And this is the craziest graph in the world, but just pay attention to the black line, because it shows that, yes, you can see here, the Paleo-Indian period, 12,000 years ago, it got much warmer until about 10,000, 9,500 years ago. And then there were blips and an overall slight increase around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago. And that it was not a lot, about a half a degree or something, but that was enough for in places this far north in Vermont to have what we hypothesize were more nut-bearing trees, slightly warmer and drier climate. And we can see, at least if numbers and sizes of sites can be used as sort of a gauge, population increases throughout the Archaic period. As opposed to the Paleo-Indian period, spear points and other artifacts that we use to identify both activities and slices of time change through time and change across space. This particular type of spear point, called an Otter Creek spear point, was made between about 6,000 and 5,000 years ago. These even earlier, about 8 to around 6,000 to 500 years ago, and various other point styles change through time reliably across the region. And in this part of Vermont, in the eastern part of Vermont, in the Connecticut River Valley, we had until recently very, very limited knowledge of this broad sweep of time called the Archaic period, mostly consisting of isolated finds reported by people along lakes or on rivers saying, oh, I found this, along a stretch of riverbank. This was found in an area, or very small archaeological deposits of 1 or 2 artifacts that hinted that there was an archaic presence in this region. We assume as archaeologists that there was a robust archaic period indigenous presence in this region. We just, again, haven't had a lot of archaeology done. But recently, the UVM Consulting Archaeology Program, in advance of a bridge replacement across the Lancaster Guildhall bridge span, and done on behalf of VTrans, found this really, really interesting site. The phase 1, or the initial archaeological excavations, the map of which is shown here, didn't really turn up a lot. A few, these blue are little positive, dots on the grid, and then one little concentration here. And actually, this phase 1 was done by another consulting firm. But in that, where they honed in, they found one remains, the remains of a single fire hearth, pretty far down in the soil, that dated to a surprisingly early date, about 6,500 years ago. And the reason why we don't know a lot about the Archaic period in the Connecticut River Valley is it's a floodplain. And so we assume that Archaic period deposits are there, but they're deeply buried under meters of soil. So they're not going to be found without really intensive excavation or some sort of catastrophic landslide, which takes them out of their context. But it seems as you go further north on the Connecticut, the deposits become shallower, and you can basically look deeper into time by digging down into the soil. So this feature was enough to say, in this part of the Connecticut, we know so little about the Archaic period. This is a very early radiocarbon date. We think that it's significant. Let's do some more work. And then the University of Vermont Consulting Archaeology program came back. You can see the bridge preparation on the far side of the Connecticut. And I don't have a lot of artifact photos because they're still being taken. I called the director, John Kroc, and said, John, I need photos. And he really obliged with a lot of cool ones, but they haven't finished the artifact photos yet. But here's some excavating artifacts in situ. It was quite a large excavation done to comply with where we knew that these deposits were going to be destroyed or filled over by the bridge approach, and so likely either destroyed or not available again. Interesting, this is a great time slice just in this pedestal here showing these are all flood deposits, these lines, and then this black line represents a very intense area of Native American habitation, essentially where they're sitting there for so long, they're introducing so much organic material in the soil that it turns black. And then another one, and then another Paleosalt going up through time. And just a diagram of all these varied flood deposits through time that cap earlier stuff. Features are the really intense areas of occupation, probably fire pits or storage pits, refuse pits. And then where the features are located. So there's a constellation of them here, which dates presumably to either the late Middle Archaic or the late Archaic period, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then up there, they got a radiocarbon date I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure is about 8,000 years old, along with very characteristic artifacts showing probably an early Archaic presence. Really the only one in this part of the state or even region. So it's a really remarkable site. One of the artifacts that they did, oops, why is that there? Oh, somehow it skipped to the end. Uh-oh, hang on. Yeah, I don't know how that happened. All right, so one of the artifacts they did find is it's not complete, but it's a preformer in the process of being made a slate bayonet, which is very, very interesting and quite odd because these, it is age appropriate for the part of the site that they found it in, 6,000, 5,000 years old. But these are coastal artifacts. These are found most prominently associated with what's called the Maritime Archaic, a group of indigenous folks living at that time along Maine and the Maritimes up into Labrador that were really oriented on sea mammal fishing. And yet we find it here along the Connecticut River, which is very, very interesting. And also the materials that we were finding at this site, and again, I didn't put a shovel in the ground, credits to UVM Consulting Archaeology, but what they were finding are not like the ones we find in the Champlain Valley, suggesting that there's different trade routes, there's different sources being utilized, there might be more connections with the coast on the eastern part of Vermont, with the folks in the eastern part of Vermont than in the western part. Things we're just starting to get a window into and we don't really understand yet. Another just little window at the Ricker Pond in Groton, a very small, only a few square meters were excavated, but probably a middle archaic or somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000. There were no materials to radiocarbon date on the site. But again, getting into that view that they're using different materials. They you know, if I had to make a guess, the materials aren't as readily available. They're using these sort of argillites, which are not very easy to work, quite fragile. They're using a lot of quartz, which is ubiquitous across the landscape, but except for very specific time periods, people don't like to use it. Indigenous people didn't seem to like to use it because it's very hard to work, and it you can't really get big pieces of it very often. And then these other sort of lower grade materials they were making scraping tools out of. Again, just giving us little windows that we can't say anything definitively at all about, but that, you know, are potential areas to look into. So the final period that I'll spend the last 10 minutes or so on is the woodland period. And we'll start with the early woodland period. And this is where we start to see along the Connecticut, again, with the exception of Guildhall, very recently excavated site, the beginnings of our archaeological view becomes better. The early woodland period is about 1,000-year period from 3,000 to 2,000 years old. It's a time period across the eastern woodlands that's very interesting because people began, select groups of people, it doesn't seem everyone participated, but select groups of people across the landscape began trading, long distance trading in non-utilitarian items, meaning either items or the materials from which they were made that didn't have a utilitarian purpose. They were made into adornments, pendants, rings, bracelets, beads for necklaces, or spear points, but that were so big in their dimensions that there's no way they could have been used for a utilitarian purpose, but were probably shows of display, perhaps used in rituals. And that's copper from the Great Lakes in Nova Scotia, banded slate, which was made into these pendants, galena, which is lead ore that was used as a paint and a pigment, lithic materials from all over, again, made into these large bifaces, and then pipestone for the earliest pipes we see in the eastern woodlands. And you know, Vermont is really a nexus of a lot of these trade corridors, or at least is a place through which a lot of people had to pass through. And again, we get windows into this. A woman in Berkshire came to the Vermont Archaeology Heritage Center a few years ago. She had found this when she was a child along the Missisquoi River, and it's remarkable. It is kind of a ceremonial, or again, one of these very large blades made out of a material that's probably from northern Labrador, raw mature, about 900 kilometers straight north. A copper axe that was found in the waters of Lake Salem. There was no smelting technology. Instead, they had to cold hammer and fire and anneal large, massive copper nuggets into shape. And those the copper that massive could only be got from a couple locations. One area of Lake Superior and in certain deposits out in Nova Scotia. And they were traded all over the eastern woodlands from those sources. And we have some of that evidence here in Vermont. And this period also marks the emergence in a lot of the eastern woodlands, including Vermont, of the first pottery making. I don't know if it's discovery or if it was information that was passed along from groups that did discover it, but all across the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes regions, pottery begins to be made. At this time period, they're very small, almost drinking cup size in general, and quite fragile. But they have, very characteristically, fabric impressed into both the interior and the exterior of them, which will become important. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Charlie Paquin, who passed away last week. He was a longtime friend of Vermont Archaeology Month, a longtime friend of mine, did a lot of experimental archaeology, including in making using only the materials that Native Americans would have had available to them, pots, and seeing how they were formed, how durable they were. He talked about how when you got good at it, you could actually see the way they glowed, how well they were firing, because there were no kilns, this was all open fire. And using tricks like channeling the wind and waiting for a windy night and channeling it into the fire to get the temperature up to make them more durable were all things he talked about. And so I really, want to, think about Charlie here in this. And again, using a little to learn a lot about the past or something about the past. I said those vessels were fabric impressed. Well, if you take clay and it's a good enough fragment that's preserved, you can impress it into it, the remains of the pot or the pot fragment, peel it out, and you can see, again, these are the negative impressions on this side, and the positive, you can see the types of fabric, sometimes the material, but certainly the warp and weft patterns that they were making, and reconstruct the types of garments, or at least the weaving pattern, none of which that we know about was done on looms, but was actually hand threaded. And an even more basic thing, these are just some schematics of that, even more basic thing is you can see the twist of individual chords that make up those fragments. There's either a right twist, which is what we call S, spinning down and to the right, or left twist, which was spinning up in Z. Usually, there's been ethnographic studies of this. It's primarily, although not exclusively, a female job, and women, girls learn through their mothers by either rolling the cord down your thigh or rolling it up. And you would learn that through time. That's how you carried it on. And I'll talk about that in a minute, why that's important in a minute. Because, okay, so the Canaan Bridge site, done in the late 80s, for another bridge replacement, the Canaan Stewartstown Bridge. Very important site for the early woodland period. And it's just some excavation shots. You can see again, flood sediments overlying this, not terribly deep, but quite deep. This was a pretty intense site. These rocks are the remains of sort of nut roasting features that they were also cooking other animals on. You can see another one of these big features here. Lots of materials that came out, a lot of evidence of nut gathering and processing, fish, a lot of beaver were being eaten. And then some of this very early pottery, which is very rare in Vermont, partially because as opposed to all the things I talked about, populations seem to have declined at the early woodland period relative to the previous periods, and partly because and so the sites are fewer and smaller, but partly because this pottery is so friable that it doesn't last well in the soil. But here we have a feature that was dated to about 2,500 years ago, give or take, with the air range with S-twist cordage. Another site in Newberry, the Carson Farm site, was done by he was a professional archaeologist, but was just sort of living in Vermont, had retired, got a grant through the Fairbanks Museum at the time in the mid-'80s and did some research. Unfortunately, he never completed a final report, but we managed to track down a lot of his collections and his slides and some of his notes. And so one of the things we've been doing at the Vermont Archaeology Heritage Center is sort of trying to piece together, because his sites that he found were really remarkable. And we wouldn't be able to do this today. This is not OSHA certified, getting 3 meters down in a telephone booth sized hole. But one of these sites in Newberry, again, look how deep they are. And again, look how much flood deposits they are, just to go back down 2,500 years. But again, finding some of this rare Venet pottery with almost an identical date, 2550 plus or minus 90, around 2,500 years ago. One of these sherds that make up this fragment of a vessel, I sent to a colleague of mine who was doing a study on trying to derive lipids or fats from 3,000 to 2,000-year-old sherds. And sure enough, she ran it, a very complex process that I won't get into, but she found the remains of fish in that pottery vessel. So, so I'll last 5 minutes or so, I'll sum up, but My colleague Jim Peterson, now deceased in 1984, is one of the first people that said, looking at cordage twists can tell you something about ethnicity or language or learning networks at a minimum. And because it's not something that you learn from your elders, whoever they may be, and it's not something that is important enough to change because you're rebelling or you want to be different. It's just an almost always unconscious learning networks. And so it's very resistant to change. And so what he did was he plotted a bunch of these sites out. And a few years ago, this is just another S-twist in the Missisquoi. He plotted a number of these sites out. And a few years ago, I expanded on his research in 1984 along with Nathan Hamilton and did it for more sites in this region and in fact beyond. But what you can see here, if you zoom in, the blue are S-twists, and then anything other than dark blue as you go light is some amount of Z-twist at sites. Again, this is cordage twist. And you can see here what he saw back in 1984, and that still continues to be true. Something is happening on the coast of Maine where the learning networks, potentially the language, the culture, that's very difficult to describe as something as simple as this, but something is happening where they're doing things different. And again, this is the area of the maritime archaic that were completely different life ways from those in the interior going back thousands of years. So perhaps even into the early woodland period, there's carry-ons of different learning networks than in the interior here, which, the sample size is small, but is almost all Z-twist, and then or S-twist. And then the further you go out, it becomes a much more muddled thing. And again, close to home here, we have two very important petroglyph sites that might date as early as the early woodland, or could be anywhere in the woodland period. The Bellows Falls petroglyphs in the bottom, and the West River petroglyphs now under the waters of the West River. So quickly, the last time period, the late woodland period from 1,000 years ago to European contact, corn, bean, squash agriculture really begins to be adopted, or is at least present in all the major river valleys, including the Connecticut River Valley in Vermont. And there's been a lot of recent research that I haven't even finished synthesizing yet. A lot of new sites that have contained corn and or beans and or squash that coming up in different parts of Vermont. So, as I have a little time, there will be some interesting follow-ups to this. This is the only remains of a full corn cob that was found in the Intervale in the late 1980s at an archaeological site. Really important site in this regard is the excavations conducted in advance of a widening of Route 78 in Swanton, probably certainly the largest scale and one of the most informative archaeological excavations of the last 15 or 20 years. There's a lot of radiocarbon dates, a lot of time periods represented. Talking about the archaic period, they excavated a feature at one time during the middle of their excavations in the late archaic period, just around 4,000 years ago, that still smelled like fish. It was filled with fish bones. It was really remarkable. But what you can see here is at the Missisquoi, this is actually east, and then this is further west out on the delta. Going back all the way to the middle archaic, again, this 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, farthest east towards out of the delta towards Swanton Center, very small habitations, early woodland in yellow, very small, a couple going on. Again, this is going farther west. But by the late woodland period, there are just huge site extents. And again, this was only for road widening projects, so the majority of their testing was only 5 meters on either side of the road. These sites probably extend, all the way across. And they're probably expanding out so much to take advantage of these agricultural fields. And populations are also probably growing larger, and they're probably staying in at least 3-season settlements. Among the things that was found dating to the late woodland period is the first longhouse ever found in Vermont, at least definitively. It's difficult to see, but there's remains of posts here, and I'll just show in a second, I'll give you a better idea of that. And on the other side of the road nearest to the river, a midden, basically a large trash deposit associated with this longhouse where they would throw their trash out towards the river. And all of those little layers are sort of trash deposits. Tons of pottery and food remains and different items that really speak to the lifeways of these folks. And then I think this will play automatically, but I did a reconstruction just because it's so hard for people to see. Yeah, so this is what the outline would be that we hypothesized based upon what was exposed. And then this is, you know, again, not totally true to life, but oh, it should be going by now. Okay, and that's, so this is what it roughly would have looked like, would have been covered in bark. And longhouses, at least among the Iroquois, there have been very few documented among the Algonquian groups, were segmented by family, and then an extended family would live in longhouses. We have no idea how many of them were across the field because, again, this is very limited. And this one is totally preserved. They dug down to expose the outline. They took a few small samples from some of the posts and the fire pits, and then they recovered it over because it's on federal land. And there might be an equivalent of this in Springfield at the Skitchewag site, a very important site in Springfield along the Connecticut River. Don't have a lot of good photos of this, but this was subject to a massive amount of erosion. So archaeologists and the National, the Soil Conservation Service came in, really just did excavation along the banks and to trim in advance of riprapping, but found remarkable remains of deep pit features, storage features, the earliest bean, domesticated bean yet dated in Vermont, abundant corn, suggesting that these village type structures dating to the late woodland period were also present in the Connecticut River floodplains and perhaps elsewhere in eastern Vermont. But unlike their Iroquois neighbors, it does not appear they stayed in any village year round. This was done by Pete Thomas in 1994, and it's difficult to see, but as you can see, they were very dependent on a variety of plants and animals. Maize, beans, squash definitely carried them through, enabled them to have surpluses, but they didn't stay in guarded villages year round like their Iroquois neighbors across the lake did, at least as we can as far as we can see archaeologically. And I'll leave it there. Questions? Any questions? Yeah.
Size of that longhouse?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I should know that. It was a couple 100 feet long. They didn't expose the whole thing, so we had to sort of guesstimate. There was a possibility it could go much farther out, but from what was exposed and then hypothesizing the rest, it was about 200 feet long.
It might be helpful to sort of repeat the question that you're answering.
Oh, yeah. So how long was the longhouse is what I just answered. Yeah.
Was the longhouse above ground for them?
It would have been above ground for them, yes. So the longhouse, the question was the longhouse above ground? Yes, it would have definitely been above ground. Some of the posts would have certainly been stuck in the ground, but you know, the structure was built above the ground. They didn't dig into the floors or anything like that, as far as we know. And again, that just goes to show the regular flooding of the outer Missisquoi out on the delta. That, you know, even 700 years has put about that much soil on top. So, yeah.
Yeah, someone was asking, how can we tell what time of year people lived in an area?
Okay, so the question is, how can you tell what type of time of year people lived in an area? So again, we have to look at a number of different indirect things. A lot of them we can never get at definitively. We make educated guesses, like where is the site located? If it's on the top of a very windswept hill, we might say it's summer because in winter it would have been absolutely brutal to be up there exposed to the winds. If you're on actually a south-facing ravine, though, you know, sort of the head of a ravine, that might very well be a winter site. Much better evidence is in the food remains that you get. You can tell, for instance, by looking at the teeth of certain animals, what season that they were killed in, how old they were, get at inferences that, looking at antler as well. You can look at short-lived species like seeds that only grow in specific types of the year. Nuts are a little bit harder because we know when they were ripe and available, but people stored nuts too. So if you're finding nut meat, that could be probably any time. But if you find the shells, it's more likely that you're actually seeing, a fall harvest, because the shells, they processed them, got rid of the shells for winter storage, as far as we understand. I'm sure there was exceptions. But, that does leave a question. I wrote to, a paleoethnobotanist a number of years ago and said, so what plants that we know Native Americans used that came up in the spring? And strawberries one, but only recently have we ever found any strawberry remains at a site. And the other one, she said, we've never found. But does that mean people weren't living here in the spring? No. And so there's archaeological biases that you have to overcome too, and just realize there's not a lot of indicators of springtime settlement. And so we can't forget that people were living here in the spring. We just won't see those indicators. Yeah.
You gave us that beautiful graphic of the longhouse.
Yeah.
But you said that was really more typical of their people. What about have you seen dwelling remnants or indications of the kinds of dwellings that are not?
Yeah. So the question is, you proposed that the longhouses were indicative of Iroquois. Were there other non-Iroquois longhouse types that we've identified? So to the first part of that question, I would say longhouses, although they're definitely associated with the Iroquois, they're a hallmark of the Iroquois. It doesn't necessarily follow that they were invented by the Iroquois, that it was an Iroquois house type. They might have emerged simultaneously among Algonquian groups and Iroquoian groups, and then became more prominent, more recognizable, more elaborated with Iroquoian groups, but were used again during this late woodland period once agriculture becomes set and intensive by both sets of groups. Having said that, we know a lot less about longhouse life, how they were segmented, how they designed them relative to Iroquois groups. We know very little. There's very little ethnohistoric record. The archaeology, even in the best of conditions and the best of sites, can only reveal so much about that. So interpretively, we don't know as much, but it's entirely possible that longhouses were adopted more or less simultaneously by Iroquois groups, beginning around 1200, and Algonquin groups. We have found other structures. Longhouses, as far as we understand currently, are really a late woodland or come part and parcel with agriculture, corn, beans, squash, intensive agriculture. Before that, when people were moving around much more regularly, it was not a suitable house type. It just took too long to make, too much effort. So the wigwam or the various circular dwellings are much more typical of Algonquin groups. And certainly we have ethnohistoric records of the Mi'kmaq and other groups using those well after European contact. Yeah.
Have you discovered any burial sites or practices?
Yes. In various time periods in Vermont and in various times over the years, Native American burials have been found. A lot of them were studied sort of early on, pre sort of, our modern awareness of how sensitive and important they are. Now there's federal and state laws that come into play. And so it wouldn't be a situation anymore where, thankfully, where you would go out and just spend a lot of time, deeply analyzing Native American burial sites. We would avoid them at all, if at all possible, if in the middle of a development, one or more was found, or the widening of a road or whatever. If they couldn't be, we would consult the appropriate tribes about how to most respectfully remove them and then reinter them somewhere appropriate. And there'd be lots of negotiations that went on with federal and state agencies, the tribes, and everything like that. Yes, they have been found. Yes, we don't want to find them necessarily. Yeah.
What's the impact of conservation in some state and federal regulation and park plan on the capacity to excavate and explore? Is that changing in recent decades?
I wouldn't say it's changing. So in state parks, federal, like Wildlife Refuge, the Green Mountain National Forest, they have their own set of rules that are federally mandated. You certainly can get permits to go excavate archaeological sites in those federal areas. It is a somewhat cumbersome process where you have to prove, the scientific merit. It likely wouldn't ever, involve burials, but you can do that in state land. Similarly, the Division for Historic Preservation gives permits to people conducting archaeological reviews. That's almost exclusively for regulatory archaeology. A state park wants to expand their parking lot or make more campsites along the lake. We would then give a permit to a consultant that the state parks would hire to go out and test for archaeological resources. That's not to say that we would never give a permit for academic research, but they would probably have to demonstrate a very compelling research design. They would have to be qualified according to the Secretary of Interior, we'd have to weigh that on a case-by-case basis. We, as the Division for Historic Preservation, would like to do some survey in this part of the state, in the eastern part of the state off of the Connecticut River, to help us better understand the indigenous sites that were here and thereby the people that lived here, so that therefore we can better interpret and protect and understand where they are to help protect and preserve them in the future. But in that case, it's a question of money and time and resources. And as Tracy can attest, all of those are in consistent short supply. So, we talk about it regularly, and it's still on my list to do, but it hasn't happened yet. Yeah.
So, in the same vein, today's lecture kind of brings us up kind of to the present time. But does archaeology tell us anything about kind of the last 300-400 years, like where we are just pre-contact and into the present era? And if not, is that because the eradication of anything like settlements in the colonial period were just so utterly, claimed over that they were just never found, or do we suspect that there were not anything like the populations up here that you get down in Massachusetts?
No, so I purposely left off the sort of contact era archaeology, of which there is some. There's not a lot, and some of it is here on the Connecticut River, and a lot of it is associated with colonial era forts. Because yes, there was a lot of antagonism, but there was also trade and exchange, things like that. Chimney Point also has a very interesting contact period presence with the French, the early French. Same with Fort St. Frederick. The Missisquoi area has an interesting time period. But it is definitely not the case that there were fewer people living here at the dawn of contact relative to other states. It's that everything became very dynamic. Vermont was one of the last regions, other than interior Maine and some areas of New Hampshire, that were occupied extensively by settlers. There's maps from 1750 era that show the Champlain Valley, that was sort of New France, the lower Connecticut in Vermont, that was Fort Dummer and all that area, which was the English. And then in between it says, this was an English map, so it said uncharted wilderness belonging to the crown. People just didn't know a lot about the interior until the late 1700s, where there was a lot of pioneers coming in, living into some of the interior locations. So I think it's entirely likely, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest, that the interior of Vermont was a sort of refuge area for Native folks after the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River became very contested. There was also a movement farther north. And then there was all sorts of, assimilation, resistance, migration back and forth that went on, throughout the early 1900s. I was talking with Marjorie Strong, the librarian at the Vermont Historical Society, and the ethno-historic or the historic record on Native people in Vermont is very, very minimal. And a lot of that, was kind of, I would cautiously conjecture, on purpose. There's a very pioneering thing about Vermont that this was a land that we came in and tamed all the trees and cut down all the forests, and no one was here before. And I don't know if they purposely wanted to write the Native presence out of the histories, or if they just wanted to seem, sort of this early mythologizing of what became Vermonters. But it's pretty ubiquitous. But if you dive deep in like places where you wouldn't usually see it, like people's personal library or diaries, they'll say, "Oh yeah, encountered a band of Indians on the river today, and they were selling baskets." The short little diary of the founder of Wolcott, the first winter he went up and was trying to clear land. He almost died and had to buy a moose off a native fellow that was coming through. And so you see these little glimpses of Native folks living in the landscape. They're just not well documented in any of the official histories, of which there are also very few. And so it's and I'm sure Fred will follow up on this in the next lecture, that archaeology definitely has a story to play. It's not abundant at this time period, but there's a lot of different processes at work going on. Yeah.
Have any fire clay artifacts been found from the Paleo-Indian period?
No. So the question is, have any fire clay artifacts been found from the Paleo-Indian period? Not in this region, or really in the eastern woodlands that are considered legitimate at all. Out west, there's some enigmatic stuff they're still trying to get to, but this was certainly pre-pottery. And there were some experiments in clay that happened throughout the early Archaic period, almost like people were trying to make figurines. There's things called poverty point objects, which are very interesting objects that were made out of clay that appear to have been early technological advancements in clay, not pots, but like figurines and things like that. But this was thousands of years after the Paleo-Indian period. There's no evidence of any sort of purposeful firing of clay for any reason that we know of. Any other? Yeah.
Can you talk briefly about the Hunter site excavated by Frank Sargent in Vermont, New Hampshire?
Yes, so I don't know a lot about the Hunter sites. I saw a New Hampshire Archaeological Society talk years ago about it, and they found a remarkable ceramic vessel, and I can't even remember what the time period of it was, but that's about all I know. I should probably know more about it, but that's about all I know. Yeah.
In the historical period, Algonquian peoples are known for really superb basketry. And isn't it plausible that that's an old tradition, but there wouldn't be a record of it?
Yeah, so basketry is very, very, almost would never preserve. I mean, there's a slight possibility that there are some buried in a bog, out there that would preserve, of which there's some pretty interesting ones around Stratford. But it just put in the ground, it wouldn't last very long at all. I always tell the story that when I was working for UVM as a professional archaeologist and digging pretty much every weekday from the time the ground thawed to the time it froze, we went out and did an initial excavation at a site, and one of us had left our trowel there. And for whatever reason, we didn't come back for another 5 years to do the subsequent excavations. And when we came back, the trowel handle, which is wooden, was completely gone and only the metal was left. And that was 5 years. And so, trying to imagine anything, hundreds of years, thousands of years, you're really just playing long odds that anything's preserved. And yet we do find things like bone and occasional perishable materials, but it's because something's happened to them. They've been charred, and so they become slightly more durable and resistant to bacteria. Bone, if it's thrown into fire, calcifies, and that calcification helps preserve it. But just something put in, or occasionally they'll be buried in limestone, close to limestone bedrock, which will neutralize all the pH of the soils and actually help preserve things. But those are pretty rare circumstances. And so, yeah, the hope of finding a basket, like I said, unless it's buried in some bog somewhere, is not likely. Yeah.
So I was wondering, to follow up on that question about whether or not there's ever been an instance where an expression from a basket is on a pot or something. And also, if you could talk a little bit more about the fabric impressions on the pots, were they just decorative, or was it something about the way they were made?
So the two questions are, have you ever found basketry impressions on Native American pottery, the negative impressions, so to speak? And why were the pots impressed with fabric? So for the first question, yes, there has been basketry impressions found in pottery, but of such a minimal amount that there's no way to determine an overall design motif or anything like that. But that is something that could happen. Why they impressed the fabric? There are probably a number of reasons, one of which might have been decorative, but the more techno-functional or utilitarian reason is because it helped to drive air bubbles out of the clay, so that, air bubbles, when again, this was not kiln, very controlled temperature, precise measurements. You were in an open fire where there were fluctuating temperatures. And if there were enough bubbles in the clay, they would blow up and it would destroy your pot. And so fabric paddling, it helped to compress the clay and drive the air bubbles out. There's also there's things in like the Amazon that I've always thought about with clay, where they purposely ridge the inside of some of their pots so that when the pots break, they can use them as like, manioc grinders, or, clean out your pots, almost like a scrub pad. So I've always wondered, maybe they were doing similar things there. It's an abrasive surface that you could use. There's no evidence of that. That's totally my conjecture. But yeah.
What do you think the oldest skeletal remains that have been found?
Right around 3,000 years ago in Vermont. Most of them from a single cemetery site in northern Vermont that was excavated in the 1970s. And all of those remains have since been reinterred at the site where they were excavated in the mid-1990s.
So why do you think that is?
It's preservation.
You have mummies. I don't know enough about.
Yeah, mummies are they're very purposeful. That's a burial practice that certainly some indigenous people in North America, definitely South America. The Incans had a very refined practice of mummification, and other highland Andean groups going all the way down to Argentina. But it's very purposeful. It actually involves a lot of chemistry and science and things like that. Not that they would have called them by those terms then, but it requires a lot to make a mummy. And then there's conditions that help preserve anything, not just human remains, like the desert Southwest has caves that they've been dry for 9,000 years, and therefore you get remarkable preservation. I mean, often in my classes that I teach, I went down to the Smithsonian, the Museum of the American Indians Curation Center, to do some research a number of years ago for my PhD. And the staff is not completely, but a majority is a majority Native American staff. And a gentleman came up, asked me what I was doing at my table. I was there 8 hours a day. The first day he came up and asked me, "What are you doing?" I told him, "Very nice." Said, "Great, nice to meet you." Walked away. The second day he came up, "How you doing?" Third day I was there, and he said, "Do you want to see the Lovelock Cave decoys?" And I said, "Yes," because I knew all about them. And he was from one of the tribes in that area, and he brought me to this rolling sort of shelves. And I couldn't touch them or anything. I wouldn't have, but they are decoys that look like ducks. They're 4,000 years old. The indigenous people put every feather back into place. But you flip them over and they're just reed baskets. And so just incredible, artistry and dedication. And they were to bring ducks down into the Great Basin areas, which are very arid, but in the flyway, they would come and land in these ephemeral swamps and ponds. And, that could set them up for a while. So yeah, really, really incredible.
What % of sites where UVM is called in are prehistoric materials found?
So it's not just UVM, there's a bunch of consultants. I should mention the Northeast Archaeology Research Center here too, because they do a lot of work here, and a number of other consultants. Hartkin Archaeological Associates works here. Then there's some out-of-state firms that do projects as well. So the question, so how many of them are pre-contact? Well, that's a long process because we at the division do a lot of work to depends upon what jurisdiction people are excavating in, but we do a lot of work to identify only those areas where there's a very distinct probability that an pre-contact archaeological site will be located before UVM or any other archaeological consultant is called in. So we've already winnowed down the universe of areas on our desks quite a bit. Then when shovels are in the ground, it varies upon area. So there's not really a good set number I could give you for how often they find things. In terms of the overall landscape, there's about half pre-contact sites and half historic area document sites in our overall site inventory that I keep as the state archaeologist. Yeah.
Is LiDAR helpful in this area?
So the question is LiDAR helpful in finding archaeological sites? And in Vermont, for pre-contact archaeological sites, so let me just say the blanket statement. It probably is one of the most important technological advances.
Can you tell us what LiDAR is?
Oh, yes. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. Essentially what happens is a plane flies over an area with a very advanced machine out the window, or actually out the door. They usually wait for leaf out conditions, either early in the spring and late in the fall. And then this machine shoots laser pulses at around 200,000 per second. And like radar or sonar, it measures time of flight back from the ground, bounce back up, and it measures that, turns that into a distance. So it can get remarkably precise maps of the ground. But the reason why it's great for archaeologists is that so when you're shooting that many measurement points, some hit the top of the trees and bounce up, some hit, middle of the way through the trees, but some hit the ground and bounce up. And when you get enough of those, you can tell the computer, okay, well, look, we see that no points are going further beyond this level. So this level is the ground, and anything above that is the tree. And then you can tell the computer, take out all the trees. And so what we use is called bare earth LiDAR, because it's essentially looking at the ground as if the forest wasn't there. And so you can see things like early historic foundations, rock walls. You can even, they're so precise, you can even see plow furrows that are 50 years old. And so it is remarkable. Now, in Vermont, it's not much help finding most sites specifically, but it's remarkable for peering through the forest to say, like, oh, look, that's the head of a drainage there, and here's a stream flowing into it. Of course, there's going to be a site there, which we would have never seen before because it was all just a big forest of trees. And previous to that, Google Earth was another remarkable advancement, just to be able to peer down. But for historic era sites, it's remarkable. It's game changing. And for my colleagues across the world, like in Guatemala, who have to peer through the rainforest, they're finding whole Tikal level, cities underneath the forest. So it's really game changing. Still, probably the greatest thing is the invention of radiocarbon dating for archaeology, but probably LiDAR and other remote sensing technologies are probably second. And they're just getting better every year too. So.
Your first slide that was divided into two halves. One side was the lake, the Champlain River Valley, and the other was something that looked like it might be related to that LiDAR that you talked about, a thermo, and I didn't catch what it was. We went on to it, so I was curious about that.
So I don't know which slide that was. But,
Oh,
the heat map. Yes. So
your answer was just reminding me of that slide.
let's see if this one's it. No.
No, it was
There. This one. Yeah. So this is just taking all those points and just running a heat map. So all the brighter colors are the denser areas of sites, and then you can see in the eastern part of Vermont, very few points that show up as any sort of density at all. Yeah.
I have a question about Coolidge and those twists. Is there a chance that the difference with the coastal, how the inland twist or the S twist, but there's that little strip of coast.
Yeah.
There's a different one. Could it be as simple as different plant availability?
It's a great question. People have looked at that.
Yeah.
I
figured it's so
Yeah.
obvious, but I'm just curious.
There, as far as we understand, the same rough cordage materials were available in coastal, or at least near coastal and interior locations. People have looked at it in greater detail in the desert Southwest,
Right.
where there's certain materials that seem to favor a certain twist more or not.
Yeah.
Yucca comes to
Right.
mind.
Like and there are no cattails.
Right.
And-
But there doesn't seem to be any difference in this region, but it is a good question.
And then I'm curious, you mentioned different learning networks. And
Yeah.
I don't really understand what that concept
It's just a broad euphemism for people talk to each other.
Right.
You talk to your friends and neighbors, how knowledge is passed on. And it might indicate that those people on the coast have ancestral, communal, perhaps language, linguistic,
Right.
ethnic ties that are somewhat separate from the rest of the region.
Right.
So, and again, it's very one small indicator.
Or could it also be, I just think of ocean fishing is very different. Like, could it have to do with the strength of the rope you needed?
It could be,
Like, or
but this gets
different-
into another, this gets, again, those weren't, so the cordage that we're looking at wasn't found in like a long cord that could have been used as a rope,
Okay.
but was rather woven into fabrics. So these were things that people would have
Right,
worn.
because this was pressed in
Yeah.
pottery.
So,
So interesting. though.
But yeah, I mean, there was a whole other issue getting it by 3,000 years ago. the deep sea fishing aspect was almost disappeared in the Gulf of Maine because a lot of the deep water species left because sea level rise, ocean currents changed, so there was no longer any swordfish. I might be saying this wrong, but cod began to be much more rare, so they became much more oriented into nearshore fishing anywhere at that time. So, all right, thanks very much.